The day Karren Prescott turned off my oxygen tank over an HOA fee, I realized I was done playing nice. It started at 8:13 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was sitting in my recliner, sunlight bleeding through the blinds, the hum of my oxygen concentrator steady beside me. That machine's kept me going since my lung collapsed 2 years ago. I'm not frail, just got a few scars and a breathing condition most people don't want to understand. But Karren? Karren was different. She made it her personal mission to sniff out any violations in our neighborhood like a bloodhound on espresso. I'm Donovan Dillard, 56 years old, former welder, widower, and until recently, the quiet guy in Lot 47 who paid his dues, kept to himself, and didn't raise a fuss. But when Karren became the HOA president last fall, everything changed. She'd walk around with her little clipboard and binoculars like she was running a military base, not a sleepy cul-de-sac in suburban Tennessee. First, she fined me for keeping my trash bins out 30 minutes past pickup. Then, for a non-regulation garden gnome my late wife had painted. I took it. I paid the fines. I pulled the gnome. But last week, I refused to pay a made-up oxygen equipment noise violation she invented. Said my machine was an auditory nuisance during community quiet hours. Never mind that it sits inside my house, behind closed windows. I told her, Karren, unless you're planning to breathe for me, I suggest you drop it. She didn't. She got worse. That morning, I'd just gotten up to make toast when the oxygen alert beeped weird. Not the usual change filter beep, but the long, high-pitched one I hadn't heard in months. I checked the machine. No power. Checked the plug still in. Then I noticed the main switch on the wall was turned off. The backup tank kicked in, but I knew it wouldn't last long. My house has a small, dedicated breaker for that outlet. I went out to the side panel, and that's when I saw it. The lock on the electrical box was cut. The switch had been manually flipped. I stood there, stunned, until I saw the fresh muddy shoe print on the grass just below the panel. It was small. Wedge heel. Karren wears those tan orthopedic wedges every damn day like she's going to a HOA gala. My camera by the front door caught everything. I checked the footage. And there she was. 7 minutes before I noticed the issue, Karren Prescott, in her beige cardigan and power walking pants, glancing around like a cartoon burglar before slipping her hand inside the unlocked gate and flipping the switch. I called the sheriff. Deputy Mallory showed up 20 minutes later, watched the footage silently, and wrote everything down. Tampering with medical equipment is a felony, Mr. Dillard, she said, her jaw tight. Do you want to press charges? I looked at the paused video still on my screen. Karren's smug face frozen mid-crime. Absolutely. But before the handcuffs came out, Karren showed up with her clipboard. Donovan, she chirped, like she hadn't just tried to kill me. We really need to talk about these escalating fines. The HOA has rules, and if you're going to continue occupying this property, you need to. Karren, Deputy Mallory interrupted, stepping forward. You're under arrest for felony tampering with a medical device. Turn around. Karren blinked like a confused owl. Excuse me. You heard me. Hands behind your back. She actually gasped, and took a step back. I am the HOA president. This is a misunderstanding. I stepped onto my porch, arms crossed. You misunderstood, thinking the HOA gave you the right to play God. She was cuffed in front of my hydrangeas. Her mouth flapped the whole time like she was auditioning for a soap opera. This is harassment. He's lying. This is retaliation because he refuses to pay his noise fees. The deputy just read her rights and walked her to the cruiser. Later that afternoon, I had a visit from Wallace, the HOA vice president. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in 4 hours. Donovan, he said, nervously adjusting his tie, we're suspending Karren from her position pending investigation. We just want to avoid any additional public embarrassment. I leaned against my porch frame. You mean like the kind where your president tries to murder a resident over a fee? He swallowed hard. That's not how we describe it. I held up my phone. You want me to show the neighborhood group chat the footage? I think they describe it just fine. His face went pale. He left with a promise to review all HOA policies. I knew what that meant, damage control. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Because when I started digging, I found out Karren had been doing a lot more than flipping switches. By the time Karren's mugshot hit the county website, an eerie hush fell over Sycamore Estates. Her supporters, especially the ones who used to parrot her every lecture about community standards, suddenly stopped walking their dogs past my house. A few even crossed the street like I was contagious. But Wallace, the vice president, wasn't so lucky. His phone rang so often the HOA office shut its blinds for 2 days straight. I wasn't interested in petty vengeance. I was interested in exposure. See, once I had her arrested, it wasn't just about me anymore. I started wondering how many other people she'd railroaded, how many violations were fabricated, and who else might have suffered in silence because they thought they had no choice. So I went hunting. My neighbor across the street, Marla, was the first one to talk. She's in her 70s, lived here longer than anyone. We'd only shared brief hellos until then, but after what happened, she brought over a thick manila folder and a cup of sweet tea. I didn't know if you were ready to take her on, she said, glancing around like someone might be listening. But if you are, I think you'll want to see this. Inside the folder were 6 letters, all printed on HOA letterhead, all demanding different payments for unauthorized landscaping, excessive seasonal decor, and even one accusing her of unsightly window treatments. One envelope had a note scribbled in the corner, pay to KP directly. Avoid official channels. I looked up. She told you to pay her personally? She said it would avoid late penalties, Marla said. It sounded fishy, but after my husband passed, I didn't want any more stress. I paid her. Twice. How much? $400 the first time. $250 the second. I took a deep breath. Did you keep any receipts? I copied the checks before mailing them. I've got them in my drawer. It was the same handwriting. Karren's blocky, all-caps script, the same she used on every HOA notice. And once I compared the bank routing number to the HOA's official account courtesy of a publicly posted financial statement, I confirmed it. The money didn't go to the HOA. It went to a personal account registered under the name Prescott Management Consulting, a company that, according to the state registry, didn't exist until 6 months ago. I didn't sleep that night. I went to the county clerk's office the next morning, combed through every publicly filed document tied to our HOA, and found what I needed. Karren had inserted her phony consulting firm into the HOA's vendor list. She'd filed it as an operational contractor and listed quarterly maintenance planning as the service. Except we didn't get quarterly maintenance. We barely got weekly grass cutting. She was siphoning money, not just through fake fines, but through consulting payments the HOA board had been blindly approving, or worse, intentionally rubber stamping. I needed someone who could confirm it all. Someone inside. That's where Tom came in. Tom was the treasurer for the HOA, but he wasn't exactly known for his spine. He was the kind of guy who apologized for sneezing. But when I knocked on his door and showed him the financial trail, he went pale. I didn't realize she was. She just submitted the invoices. Said they were for stormwater assessments and vendor coordination. She ever show you any reports? Any deliverables? He shook his head slowly. No, just the invoices. I figured she had the authority. She didn't. I watched him crumble. She told me if I questioned anything, I'd be in violation of fiduciary negligence. She said the board could be sued if I disrupted normal operations. She lied. He rubbed his forehead like he was trying to wipe the memory off his skin. How much trouble am I in? That depends. You willing to help me take this to the DA? He hesitated. Will it come back on me? Only if you stay quiet. 48 hours later, I was sitting in the office of Assistant District Attorney Rosalind Vega, laying out a binder full of bank transfers, fake notices, check copies, and forged vendor forms. Tom sat next to me, sweating into his collar, but he answered every question. Marla had given her statement earlier that morning. Another neighbor, Enrique, came forward with a photo of Karren yanking out his solar-powered pathway lights and snapping them in half after accusing him of installing unsanctioned lighting. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about power, control, and now, destruction of property. I've seen crooked HOAs, Vega said, flipping through the pages. But this is organized theft, fraud, possibly even racketeering, depending on how many board members were involved. Can you charge her? Not just her. If this board knew and did nothing, they're getting subpoenas, too. Within a week, subpoenas were served to 3 HOA board members, Wallace among them. He tried playing dumb, but the time-stamped meeting minutes with his signature approving Karren's consulting payments told a different story. Tom, to his credit, turned over every email and invoice he had, even the ones where Karren threatened to restructure the board if anyone challenged her authority. The next HOA meeting was different. It wasn't held in the clubhouse. It was held at the Community Recreation Center, and for the first time, Residents showed up in droves. Folding chairs filled. People stood along the walls. Marla sat in the front row. I stood near the podium with Vega, who had been invited at my request to speak about the investigation. Wallace tried to open the meeting with a bland statement about recent events. Vega cut him off. "Let me make this clear," she said, her voice carrying across the room like a courtroom gavel. "We have confirmed that HOU funds were misappropriated. Fake fines were issued. Residents were intimidated into paying fees that never went to the association's account. And in at least one case, a resident's medical equipment was intentionally tampered with. You could have heard a pin drop." Then she pointed to the projector screen where a bank statement lit up, showing a series of payments to Prescott Management Consulting. Each one tied to a date Karren had filed a complaint or issued a fine. She's being charged with felony fraud, embezzlement, and criminal endangerment. And if any member of this board was complicit, they're next. Wallace stammered. "We didn't know," she never said. "You signed the checks." The crowd erupted. Not in anger, at least not only. There was relief in the air. Vindication. People who had been bullied for years were suddenly standing tall. One man in the back laughed out loud. Someone else clapped. Then more joined in. It wasn't a celebration. It was a reckoning. By the end of the meeting, a vote was held. The board was dissolved. A transitional committee elected on the spot was formed to audit every policy, every fee, every contract. Tom was asked to stay on as a liaison. He accepted, but only if Vega's office remained involved until everything was clean. As for me, I didn't ask for a title. I didn't want one. But they gave me a standing ovation anyway. And when I left that night, I passed by the old clubhouse where Karren used to hold court like a queen. The locks had been changed. Her name scraped off the mailbox. And for the first time in years, Sycamore Estates felt like a neighborhood again. 2 weeks after the emergency HOA meeting, the neighborhood buzz had started to shift from outrage to curiosity. The kind of curiosity that made people start knocking on doors they hadn't visited in years. Lawn chairs reappeared on porches. Conversations lingered longer. But behind all that sudden friendliness was the same question everyone was quietly asking. How deep did Karren's corruption go? Deputy Mallory came by again, this time without the cruiser. She parked her own sedan by the curb and walked up my driveway with a thin folder tucked under her arm and a look that told me the story wasn't over. "You got a minute?" she asked. When I nodded, she handed over the folder. Inside were copies of building permits, contractor receipts, and a signed approval form with Wallace's name on it. But the address listed wasn't any of the homes in Sycamore Estates. It wasn't even in our zip code. She used HOA funds to renovate a private property, Mallory said. A small cottage about 20 minutes outside town. Registered under a shell company we traced back to her cousin in Knoxville. I flipped through the documents. The renovations included new plumbing, electrical work, granite countertops, and even a custom-built patio. The receipts were billed to Community Infrastructure Enhancement, a term so vague it could have meant anything. She called it a satellite office for association retreats, Mallory went on. But there's no documentation that anyone from the board ever visited it. No meetings. No events. Just her signature on the invoices and Wallace's rubber stamp. Whose name is on the deed? Her cousin's. But the utilities are in hers. And neighbors say she's been staying there every other weekend for the past year. I leaned back, absorbing it. So she used our fees to build herself a vacation home? Mallory nodded. And that's just what we verified. There's more coming. I handed the folder back. You think this bumps up the charges? We're talking wire fraud, mail fraud, misuse of public funds, tax evasion. If we push federal charges, she could be looking at serious time. That same afternoon, a subpoena landed in the mailbox of every resident on the former board. Not just Wallace, but the secretary, the so-called compliance officer, and even the community events coordinator. They were all being investigated for knowingly approving unauthorized expenses. But while the legal gears turned, I turned my attention to something more urgent, restoring what had been lost. See, Karren's reign didn't just drain bank accounts. It drained dignity. People had been isolated, pushed into silence, humiliated over arbitrary rules and threats. So I started organizing something different. Not another meeting. Not a protest. A reckoning of a different kind. I called it the Reclamation Weekend. We kicked it off with a neighborhood workday. Not the kind Karren used to mandate where she'd circle around with a clipboard, counting who showed up. This was voluntary. No guilt trips. No fines. Just a sign-up sheet, a stack of paint cans, and a community ready to fix what had been ignored. I borrowed a pressure washer from a buddy of mine in Gallatin, and we started scrubbing down the community walls that had been streaked with algae for the past 3 years. Kids chalked up the sidewalks while their parents patched fences and pruned back overgrown bushes. Even Tom showed up with a toolbox and helped replace warped boards on the community deck by the pond. That night, we held a bonfire behind the clubhouse. No permits, no permission slips, just hot dogs, folding chairs, and real stories. Marla stood up first, her voice steady for the first time in a long while. I used to think I was the only one getting those letters, the only one scared to speak up. Turns out, we were all scared, just not of the same thing. Then Enrique spoke about the time he was fined for planting marigolds and how he'd almost sold his house over it. And then a young couple I'd never met before told us about the time they were threatened with eviction for leaving their stroller on the porch. By the time the fire died down, we weren't just neighbors anymore. We were witnesses, allies, and nobody wanted to go back to the way things had been. The next morning, I got a call from ADA Vega. "Donovan," she said, her tone clipped, "we've got a development. Karren's attorney just proposed a plea deal. She'll admit to embezzlement and fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence. That it? She's offering to testify against Wallace. Says he knew everything. Says he was getting a cut." I sat up straight. "You believe her? She's got documentation. Emails, bank transfers, even voice recordings she secretly made during their planning meetings. She's a snake, but she's a thorough one. And Wallace?" I asked. "We're issuing an arrest warrant today." By sundown, Wallace's house was surrounded. Not dramatically. No sirens. Just 2 unmarked cars and a knock on the door. He tried to pretend he wasn't home, but the officers had a warrant and a locksmith. He came out in a rumpled bathrobe, red-eyed and defeated. The next day, news vans showed up. First one, then 2 more. Word had spread beyond the county. A local radio station aired a segment titled HOA Horror, When Power Turns Criminal. They interviewed Marla right on her front lawn. She didn't hold back. She told me my rose bushes were a public hazard. Meanwhile, she was using our money to build herself a lakeside hideaway. But what really flipped the script was when the DA's office released the transcripts from Karren's recordings. In one clip, Wallace could be heard laughing about milking the fines before tax season and joking that half these retirees wouldn't know embezzlement from a bake sale. That was the final nail. The Transitional Committee held a vote to permanently dissolve the current HOA structure. From now on, any new community leadership would be elected every 6 months, with term limits and open financial records. No more secret vendor contracts. No more fines without due process. And best of all, no more blanket enforcement authority. We replaced the old HOA office sign with a new one that simply read, Community Resource Center. It became a place where neighbors could meet, share ideas, and handle disputes like adults instead of defendants. 2 months after Karren's arrest, I got a letter not from a lawyer, not from the county, but from a woman named Delilah who had been visiting her father in a nearby neighborhood. She wrote about how her dad had been fined for a wheelchair ramp, and how he'd been considering moving because of the stress. But then he heard about Sycamore Estates and our story. He stayed, fought back, got support, and eventually their HOA backed off. "You gave him his home back," the letter read, "and you gave me my dad back." I kept that letter in my kitchen drawer, next to the extra oxygen filters. Not because I needed a reminder of what I'd done, but because it reminded me what we all deserved: peace, dignity, and the right to live without fear of the very people meant to serve us. Karren pled guilty. Wallace went to trial and lost. The rest of the board signed non-prosecution agreements in exchange for full cooperation, community restitution, and lifetime bans from holding any leadership position in a residential association. And me? I went back to welding on the weekends. Nothing fancy. Just lawn sculptures and wind chimes made from old horseshoes. People started requesting them. Marla asked for one shaped like a phoenix. Seemed fitting, because out of all the rust and ash, something better had taken root. And this time, we were the ones setting the rules. On a hazy Thursday morning, 3 months after the HOA board was dissolved, I got a call from ADA Vega. Her voice was clipped, but her words were deliberate. "We need to meet. Something's come up. Serious." I told her to come by the house. When she pulled up, she wasn't alone. Another woman stepped out of the passenger side, mid-40s, dark blazer, sharp eyes. Vega introduced her as Special Agent Monroe with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. She's been digging into some financial anomalies tied to your HOA, Vega said. Turns out, Karren and Wallace were just the tip of the iceberg. I led them inside, poured coffee, and waited. Monroe pulled out a laptop and turned it toward me. There was a spreadsheet open columns of dates, dollar amounts, and codes. Most of it looked like digital static to me, but then I saw the headings. HOA dues, legal retainer transfers, insurance reimbursements. One column was labeled Disbursement Internal. These, Monroe said, tapping the screen, are payments made from the HOA's insurance policy. Specifically, liability coverage claims. I frowned. We never filed any claims while I lived under them. That's the thing. You didn't. They did. Dozens. Over the past 2 years, Karren had been quietly filing false liability reports on behalf of the HOA's fake slip and falls, alleged tree root damages, even a fabricated electrical fire in a house that had been vacant for 6 months. Each claim triggered a payout from the community's insurance, which was then funneled through a shadow legal fund she and Wallace created under the name Community Risk Counsel. She was laundering insurance money through a shell law firm, Vega added. And they weren't just pocketing it. They were using parts of it to pay off contractors, silence internal whistleblowers, and fund political donations. I blinked. Political? Monroe nodded. Campaign contributions to a sitting county commissioner. In exchange, she ensured code enforcement never investigated this neighborhood despite multiple complaints over the years. That was the moment it all landed. What I thought had been a personal vendetta, a tyrant with too much time, and a clipboard, was actually a coordinated operation. We weren't just victims of a corrupt HOA. We were the ground floor of a small-scale criminal enterprise. Vega leaned forward. We have enough now for federal charges. But we need more than just the financials. We need someone who lived through it, who can testify to the intimidation, the manipulation, the way they silenced dissent. I didn't hesitate. The grand jury was convened by the end of the month. I was the first witness called. The courthouse was packed, press, attorneys, even a few former board members who had turned state's witness and now sat with lawyers in stiff suits, looking like they hadn't slept in weeks. The prosecutor, a federal attorney from Nashville, questioned me for over an hour. Can you describe the methods Ms. Prescott used to enforce compliance? She trespassed, fabricated citations, threatened medical retaliation, and used her position to isolate residents. I said clearly. She didn't manage a community. She ruled it. What was the tone of her communication? Authoritarian, deceptive, and when challenged, retaliatory. Did you witness any specific act that endangered a resident's well-being? Yes, I said. She cut power to my oxygen concentrator. I have the footage. The jury listened. Stoic. Focused. But it was Marla's testimony that cracked the room open. She recounted how Karren had once threatened to report her to Adult Protective Services if she didn't remove a non-standard flower trellis. Said she'd declare her mentally unfit to manage a property. Then came Tom. He had a ledger in hand, Karren's private compliance log. It listed names, notes, and something called a disruption index. Residents were ranked on how likely they were to push back. Those with high scores received more letters, more inspections, more fines. She treated us like liabilities, Tom said, like threats to be neutralized. At the end of the second week, Karren's attorney made a last-ditch motion to dismiss the case, claiming overreach and community bias. The judge denied it, citing overwhelming evidence. The trial itself lasted only 4 days. Karren sat in a navy suit, her hair pulled back so tight it looked like it hurt. She didn't look at me once. Not during the recordings. Not during the witness statements. Not even when the prosecution played the video of her flipping the power switch on my concentrator. When the verdict came in, it was unanimous. Guilty on 16 counts: fraud, conspiracy, mail tampering, insurance theft, abuse of a vulnerable adult, and criminal endangerment. Wallace followed soon after, convicted on 11 counts tied to financial complicity and obstruction. The sentencing hearing was quiet. No theatrics. Just a judge who had seen enough. Karren got 15 years without parole. Wallace got 9. Both were ordered to pay restitution to the HOA and to every resident who had been fined under fraudulent circumstances. The restitution fund was created the following month. Every neighbor who had ever paid a bogus fine or been forced into unnecessary compliance upgrades was given a check. Some were small $50 here, $100 there. But a few, like Enrique and Marla, received thousands. The community voted to use the remainder of the recovered assets to build a new park. Not a sterile HOA-mandated green space, but a real park, with benches, a community garden, and a hand-painted wooden sign that read, "We take care of each other here." The day we cut the ribbon, I stood next to Marla and Tom. The sun was high, and the smell of fresh soil drifted through the air as kids ran through the grass. A local band played under a pop-up tent. Someone grilled sausages on a flat top near the sidewalk. A man I didn't recognize came up to me. Said his name was David. Said he just moved in from 2 counties over. "I heard what you did," he said. "Whole neighborhood did. You set the standard." I nodded. "I just got tired of being quiet." Marla chuckled behind me. "You woke the whole block up, Donovan." Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the houses, I sat on the new bench closest to the garden. The scent of rosemary and tomatoes filled the air. The hum of sprinklers clicked on in the distance. No more surveillance. No more bogus citations. Just peace. Agent Monroe stopped by once more before closing the case. She handed me a file sealed, but marked with an official stamp. "What's this?" I asked. "Official closure. But I added something extra," she said. "A letter of recognition. From the state. For your role in exposing systemic abuse." You didn't just get justice. You set a blueprint. I didn't open it right away. Didn't need to. Because I already had what I wanted. A neighborhood that belonged to its people again. A place where nobody had to fear a knock on the door or a letter in the mailbox. A place where justice didn't come from a clipboard but from truth. And in the end, that truth burned hotter than any fine she ever wrote.